Hello all, I am Deniz Yonucu, Direction Section Co-Editor of Polar, and today I'm joined by Risa Cromer, Katie Dow, and Elyse Singer. We will be discussing the article titled Deploying Fetal Death, Fetal Burial Laws, and the Necropolitics of Reproduction in Indiana. The article is authored by Risa Cromer and Sophie Bjork James, and Risa is joining us today. And it was published in May 2023 issue of Polar. The article, as the title suggests, is on necropolitics of reproduction and does a great job on showing how abortion policies in the United States, or in Indiana in specific, are intertwined with racism, Christian ideology, and anti-environmentalism. I'll be moderating the discussion today, and Elyse and Katie will be engaging with Risa and Sophie's article. So, Risa, could you please tell us a little bit about your own work? I believe you also have a book recently published in 2023 on similar issues. Can you just give a summary of your work and the article?
I'd be happy to. Thank you, Deniz, for this opportunity to be in conversation with two scholars whose work I much admire and whose works are so instructive for me in my own thinking. So thank you again. Yeah, so this article started as a think piece for a workshop held in 2021, hosted by the Reproductive Righteousness Project, which I co-lead with Leah Tarragon-Zeller and Sarah Franklin. So Sophie and I are friends, actually, and colleagues from graduate school, where we both became feminist scholars of white evangelical politics in the United States, and both have nurtured our interests in reproductive and racial politics. And our career paths have led us to both now reside in conservative states. So I live in Indiana, and Sophie lives in Tennessee. A few months before the Reproductive Righteousness Project, Sophie and I had worked on an essay for the Medical Anthropology Quarterly's critical care blog, interrogating what pro-life politics came to mean during the pandemic, in which we foregrounded activities, political efforts within our respective states of residence. And during that time, we've both since launched our first books into the world. In 2021, Sophie's book, The Divine Institution, came out. And last year, 2023, my book, Conceiving Christian America, came out. And since those launches, we've begun giving our attention, respective ethnographic attention, to local politics where we reside. And so this article is an outgrowth of a moment in our careers when we began leveraging our anthropological and our advocacy skills to respond to phenomena that we've become experts in other places, but are shaping the world in which we now live. So we decided to focus our think piece on Indiana's fetal burial bill, HB 1337, which became law in 2016. As an illustrative example of how the anti-abortion movement is advancing its radical agenda to confer personhood status to embryos and fetuses. In this case, by including aborted human fetuses as grievable human subjects requiring burial by state mandate. So this law is one of a dozen that exist on the books in US states, though it was the first to receive review by the newly composed United States Supreme Court, which in 2019 affirmed Indiana's right to require fetal burial services. Just want to note that in Sophie's state of residence of Tennessee, the legislators there passed a version of this bill in 2021. And by that point in time, these kinds of bills were not being regarded as vicious and deleterious, but had become more mainstream and recognized as the new normal in this heightened state of egregious assault and attack on abortion rights, particularly through the vehicle of personhood politics. So just to comment on how rapidly a radical aspect of the anti-abortion movement's agenda could become mainstream, and the post-Dobbs context is only amplifying that fact. So a second goal of this article is to situate this particular personhood policy strategy within a socio-historical context, in this case, Indiana. And so we do so by providing a look at Indiana's abysmal infant and maternal mortality metrics. It ranks among the bottom 20% and even less in the United States. The systemic disregard for harms, toxic harms to youth, such as through lead exposure, and the incessant deregulation of environmental protections that will and are exacerbating the effects of climate disruption in the region. And we argue that these contextual features of Indiana's landscape reveals the necropolitical dimensions of hypervaluing fetal subjects, while at the same time diminishing the bodied environment and environments on which all life, including fetal life, depends. And so to make this case, we foreground the work of Black feminist scholars, including teachers of ours like Leith Mullings, posthumous concept by Leith Mullings, and former professor at the CUNY Graduate Center, where Sophie and I both went to school, as well as Kiara Bridges and Dorothy Roberts, whose work instructed us to investigate what kinds of human subjects fetuses become through these burial bills, and the socio-historical context within which these subjects come to matter politically. Of course, at the same time, which human subjects come to not matter politically is the other side of that coin. So Leith Mullings' framework, Necropolitics of Reproduction, proved especially useful for illustrating how fetal personhood politics don't just inflate fetal subjects, but they simultaneously undermine the personhood of pregnant people, especially people of color, which we wish to amplify through the stories of cases like Purvi Patel and Bebe Shrey, who were charged with criminal allegations in Indiana for poor pregnancy outcomes, and the environments in which all of us may or may not thrive. And so this article provides a discursive rather than ethnographic analysis, which we recognize as a valuable mode of anthropological inquiry for parsing authoritative knowledge like policy, science, and law, as well as tracing and interrogating their social effects. And I'll end with this overview by saying that Sophie and I are both conducting ethnographic research within our respective states on the effects of anti-abortion policies on social life, particularly in post-ops context, which I can speak more about if and of interest, but I'm looking forward to, of course, hearing from Katie and Elyse. So thank you again for this opportunity.
Thanks, Risa, and I'm sure Elyse and Katie have a lot of questions to ask, and they're both amazing scholars who also work on the politics of reproduction. So I'll start with Elyse. So what kind of questions do you have, Elyse? What are your comments that you want to share with us today?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and thanks for inviting me, Risa, to this conversation. It was a pleasure to read this article, and I learned an incredible amount. So I'll just say a couple notes on the article which I sent along, but to me, this is clearly a timely and important contribution to what is now sort of an exploding body of work on reproductive justice, and particularly on reproductive justice in the post-Dobbs present in which we now all find ourselves, even though I understand that this piece was sort of in the works even before Dobbs was handed down and Roe was overturned. And I'll say a few words before I ask specific questions, but for me, one of the most powerful aspects of this analysis is what you just articulated, Risa, which was sort of this inherent contradiction in a bill like HEA 1337, the hypervaluation of fetal lives and the mandated grieving of fetal loss, at the same time that there's a range of insidious and troubling racist and anti-environmentalist policies in Indiana, which like you say, undermine the lives of sort of full humans in the world, and particularly brown and Black residents of Indiana, patterns which we see elsewhere in the United States, of course. I have several questions, and more than specific questions designed to sort of challenge what was a very clear and coherent and compelling argument. There are sort of provocations or jumping off points for a conversation. I'm curious, this wasn't the precise focus of your article, which you mentioned is discursive rather than ethnographic, but I am interested sort of conceptually in how this bill changes sort of the role of the abortion provider from a medical worker into a kind of worker who's now obligated to coordinate with funeral homes, right? Other kinds of potentially stigmatized workers, and what just sort of what this means about the role of the abortion provider in this moment in Indiana. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts about that.
I do. So perhaps we'll do a call and response. So I have some thoughts about that as well. So thanks, Elyse. Yeah, so Kara Bridges attuned us to this idea of deploying death. And so that's where the title gets its inspiration from. She wrote an article for UCLA Law Review called Deploying Death, and asks in it, how will death be deployed in the wake of Roe's overruling? And she does a nice historical situating of the ways that death has been deployed by abortion foes as well as abortion supporters for decades as a way to claim position on their approach, which is like for abortion rights or in opposition to them. And so how will death be deployed is a really interesting question here. My sense is that the fetal burial disposition requirement that HEA 1337 now requires, and I will say that it was passed in 2016, but went through a lot of legal hoops and didn't begin being implemented until November 22. And so that was in a really interesting legal limbo. So Indiana was the first state to ban abortion following the Dobbs ruling in June of 22. It went into effect for about 2 weeks, and then it was held up. And so for 11 months. So Indiana was anticipating a ban going into effect for about a year. And in that liminal space, the courts had ruled that the fetal burial bill in November of 22 would begin to be required. So from November 22 to August 22, we had this period of time where abortions were still legal in Indiana, not banned yet, and there is the new fetal burial bill requirement. And so there's however many months that is, 8 or so months of time where the Planned Parenthoods, the outpatient clinics like Whole Women's Health, as well as the hospital providers were having to coordinate with funeral services. At this juncture, starting in August of 23, when the ban went into place, abortion through legal exception is only provided by one health system in Indiana. So the Planned Parenthoods stopped providing abortion services because by law they were disallowed to. The law created ambulatory surgery center trap law, essentially, that disallowed outpatient clinics to provide abortion anymore. And so it all became concentrated within the IU health system. And there are only 2 providers in Indiana who do abortion services through legal exception. And I'm beginning a research project with them to trace patient navigation for people who are directed to family planning services through IU Health. They're also the first to receive assault by our Attorney General, going after their medical license and trying to criminalize them from the provider side to create a chilling effect and more hesitancy among providers of abortion care, even though legal. So just to provide a little context within which this requirement has been in place. So abortion providers as death workers, I think is a really conceptually interesting idea. In practice, what I have learned from people who are having to read these scripts, as well as I don't know from patient perspective. I've only been able to talk to providers about like, what does this document mean in your hands? What happens within this health system? And I only have insight from the hospital side, is that it's one of many. So they have parental consent, they have mandatory waiting periods, they have a lot of state mandated scripting of what they're required to say and counsel, that is undermining of their professional sense of what is do no harm, right? Good practice. And in the sense of Mara Bookbinder's article that you mentioned earlier, Elyse, in your comments to me privately on scripting dissent, there's so much resonance with the tension that people feel like we have to do this because we wish to stay open. And in practice, also what this does is align us with state through mandated speech documentation and reporting. It undermines our abilities to accompany patients through what we think would be a more humane process by requiring providers to act as agents of the state, often against their professional will. So aligning abortion providers with death work is intriguing in this particular form. It's also not new. We know conceptually from like Kira's historical work and many others' historical work that stigmatizing abortion by affiliating it with murder and dirty work is old. And so this is sort of a non-novel articulation of that. What I think of is, I have two thoughts here that I think of as possibly interesting. So one, how fetal burial bills are an exemplar of personhood politics. So they're not just targeting abortion, they're trying to confer status to fetuses, embryos and fetuses as persons, which has another kind of agenda. So what I think of here is not just or only the enrollment of abortion providers as death workers, but the potential and likelihood of expanding the affiliation of death work to other kinds of healthcare providers, like reproductive endocrinologists and embryologists who provide IVF services, thinking here of the ex utero embryo frozen and held within cryopreservation tanks or in vitro as other kinds of embryonic subjects that these political actors are trying to confer status to as well. They have not yet been affiliated with death workers. And I am seeing some of the sort of effort and desire to mount that kind of effort to undermine the legitimacy and access to services like repro medicine. My second thought here is that advocates for reproductive rights and justice have been working really hard to align abortion work with life-saving and life-supporting efforts. And that's all rhetorical work. And a lot of evidence that when we listen to people who have abortions say that abortion is save their lives. I'm also interested in those for whom the fact that abortion is the best of their options still is grievable. And so that abortion is not necessarily, the process of abortion is not necessarily a grievable thing. Abortion isn't grievable, abortion isn't dirty. The context within which that is the best option is grievable for people, for many people. I mean, we can look, and when we listen to folks who are processing real emotions around pregnancy decisions, who have abortions, acknowledging that grief is something that people experience in nuanced ways without attaching that to abortion as dirty or abortion providers as death workers, I think is a real feminist job. And so I'm curious and hopeful for a possible future in which repro justice work could frame abortion work as inclusive of both life-saving and a form of death work. Death here being representative of transformation, of change, of loss, but not necessarily loss of fetal life, but loss of, you name it, dreams, loss of circumstantial possibility, right? That there is a both and here for many when we listen to them about their abortions. And I think a feminist whole kind of embrace of what people who have abortions experience would do well, I think, to move beyond a binary of being life-saving or life-harming. and find our way through that can embrace sort of thresholds more meaningfully.
Thanks so much, Risa. And you also talk about the women who lose their lives while giving birth, and there's a disproportionality there too. Black and brown women are disproportionately vulnerable while giving birth. So that also complicates the picture. So this feminist work, I guess, should be accompanied by an anti-racist work as well. And you show very well in the article how this is all intersectional. So Katie, can we hear your questions, your take on the article?
Yeah, sure. And also just to say thank you, and it's a privilege to be asked to discuss this really fascinating and clearly articulated article. So yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Katie, but we can't hear you properly.
I don't know what to do about that other than to shout.
Okay, it's getting better.
As far as I know, there isn't any technical problem. Is that any better?
Yeah, it's better, definitely.
Okay. It might be because the fan's going on my computer, which is very
odd.
odd.
Okay.
Sorry. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to start by saying thank you for inviting me to discuss this and the opportunity to really read and engage with your and Sophie's article, Risa, which I find fascinating and clearly articulated discursive critique, as you say, of Indiana's fetal burial law. And I think it's really fascinating how the law, as you describe it, constructs the fetus not only as breathable life, but also as an individual, as you were just touching on. And I was also thinking about these kinds of binary oppositions when I was reading it. And you start with the observation about how pro-life discourse is in fact equally interested in death. And I think that in itself is sort of setting up a binary opposition, which is seeking to reduce the debate itself into binary camps: pro and anti, life and death, care and kill, and so on. And that's, you know, something that we as feminist scholars constantly have to kind of pay attention to and not get drawn into. Not that I'm saying that you are, but you know, as a general point and reminder. And I think what you show and what's really fascinating about this particular case is that the rhetoric is in many ways much more about the why and the who of abortion. And your article obviously particularly focuses on the who, so the personhood or attributed personhood of fetuses. And as you mentioned, the extension of personhood earlier and earlier into developmental biology. But implicitly, I think there's also the why, and that why question is the specificity that abortion is seen is attributed to abortion by anti-choice proponents. So it's not only about death, it's about killing or murder, or the idea of that. So I think it's a really important reminder that it's about the assumed intent and intention, which is often backgrounded in campaigning, particularly anti-choice campaigning, which tends to favour this more sort of black and white binary opposition rhetoric. And so your article did a really good job of complicating that and saying, well, actually, it's linked with all these things which might not be immediately apparent, but actually, you know, in fact, it all kind of works together. And one example of that is the claim that you mentioned about the Cornwall Alliance, that environmental issues are health issues while abortion is life and death. So right there, you see that's sort of leaning into that binary opposition and avoiding the connections that you are quite rightly drawing between the necropolitics of reproduction, of racism, of climate change and environmental degradation. So I've got many other things to say about it. But maybe one thing I'll just mention for the moment, because it's kind of related, is that I was really struck also by the quote from Tanya Marsh about the philosophical goal of the law, which is a great way of phrasing it. So this is a law that's not only reflecting some people's moral values, but it's also intended to shift the discourse. So it's sort of like a kind of moral Overton window. I think that's really interesting and important to kind of capture these strategies. But again, it's sort of coming back to this question of who is alive and who gets to decide that. Is, you know, obviously what's chilling about these kinds of laws. So you show the importance of individuality to notions of personhood as they figure in this law, and how it's linked with Christian ideas, which I find very interesting and convincing. But I wondered if you could also expand on this in relation to capitalism and ideas, the sort of nexus of ideas about individualism, Christianity and capitalism, and maybe also, if it's not too expansive, if you could discuss how that also relates to the intersection of racism and environmental injustice that you describe in the article.
Yeah, thank you, Katie, for your close reading and your thoughts. They're actually quite insightful. So what I want to say is actually, you know, obviously your insight about individualism as it connects not just to racist or colorless notions of personhood that Charles Mill articulates in his interrogation of the idea of personhood in the founding of the United States as a nation, as well as a sort of Christian ideological underpinnings of the notion of personhood as well, that this sort of elephant in the room when talking about white supremacy and Christian ideology in the US context is capitalism. So Sophie's work, I want to direct listeners here to Sophie Bjork James's work. I'm going to focus on one of her recently published pieces that responds to this well. So she, in the section on environmentalism, racist environments is really leaning on Sophie's expertise and scholarship, because she's been doing quite a bit of work on evangelical politics and anti-environmentalism, and interrogating sort of the maintenance of particular majority positions despite a growing trend among evangelicals toward pro-environment stances, and sort of why that's not gaining more traction. She explains the underlying logics that keeps environmental politics and the Christian right more generally, which has long held abortion as the keystone political flag for the movement, with a focus on the fetus and also anti-environment. So her most recent article was published in the Women's Studies International Forum, actually in the special issue from the Reproductive Righteousness Project that I helped co-edit. Her article is called "Focus on the Fetus, the Evangelical Ethic, Anti-Environmentalism, and the Spirit of Neoliberalism." So in it, she's explaining how anti-environmentalism among abortion foes coheres through a pro-market logic in which the celebration of unfettered capitalism becomes the justification for both anti-abortion stance and anti-environment stance. And that statement from the Cornwall Alliance really captures and distills down what she noticed, which is abortion is framed as a sort of, and temporally as a sort of a more immediate threat to human life, whereas risks and threats to the environment through toxins, mercury, lead, et cetera, are seen as more slow and long-term, less immediate forms of threats to human life. And so in the era of expediency, when it comes to protectionism or saving human life, anti-abortion positions becomes this sort of moralized political stance here, the priority. That is the rhetorical position. Her argument goes deeper to suggest that it is no coincidence that the US anti-abortion movement, which came of age under an event led by evangelicals in the early 1980s, quickly yoked itself to the neoliberal project that was designed and developed under President Reagan. So that right-wing bloc in the United States context that launched Ronald Reagan into the presidency in 1980 was this odd affiliation of new political allies, pro-life Catholics, evangelicals who were not, conservative evangelicals who were not yet anti-abortion. They had not had a historical position on abortion, and right-wing neocons who were pro-market. And the alliance of their political relationship for political pragmatism, to put Reagan in the White House, created a sort of political relationship between anti-abortion politics and neoliberalism. And so we see in this sort of really enduring hyper-individualization of the fetal subject, we can hear in it that neoliberal effect of individualization, which we feel when we're told that our healthcare is our responsibility, when our lives and livelihoods, our ability to earn money, to house ourselves, to feed ourselves nutritiously are our responsibility. These are all messages from capitalism. It is also the same kind of messaging we hear, especially as pregnant, capable people, around the responsibility for our reproductive health outcomes and for bearing the burdens of negative outcomes that may come to the fetuses we might bear. And so it is a very consistent kind of logic that coheres it. And Sophie described this as the evangelical ethic that kind of provides that spirit of neoliberalism is anti-abortion, and it continues to compel the majority at the moment among the Christian right to maintain an anti-environmentalist stance, even though there are many within not enough, but many within evangelical community who recognize that a pro-life positionality and pro-life politics could very easily include and embrace pro-environment positionality. And because of that maintenance of anti-abortion and anti-environment, we see a requirement to maintain a sort of diminishment of systemic violence caused through racism, of course, patriarchy, and as well as all the environmental degradations that are resulting from many of these kinds of investments. So want to direct readers to Sophie's work, who I think speaks most profoundly to some of these curiosities and questions that you have.
Thanks so much, Risa. Shall we continue with you, Elyse? Do you have any additional questions?
Yes. At the end of the article, of the piece, you, Risa, and Sophie sort of indicate that this bill, or let me rephrase here. You, in my understanding, you sort of begin to think and write this piece perhaps before Dobbs, right, before Roe falls, and then it comes out sort of in the same timeline. But now we're in a different moment. It's 2024, and I'm wondering sort of what this one bill, HEA 1337, in one conservative red US state can sort of tell us about where we're headed, the future of abortion as an entity. I won't say abortion rights, because they sort of cease to exist, at least at the federal level in our country, in the US, but also pro-life work in post-Dobbs America. So sort of zooming out, what does this case study tell us, or what can we expect or fear?
Yeah, thanks, Elyse. It's scary. Okay, so this bill is providing a few clues for us. So first of all, embryo and fetal personhood is our clue here. So even though this is specifically connected to abortion, fetal burial bills requiring the burial of fetal remains following abortion, I will say that fetal burial bills for patients experiencing miscarriage preceded this as an actual feminist effort to create more mourning and grieving opportunities that are humane and consistent with people's diverse experiences when encountering pregnancy loss, had been implemented as law, and then had been seized and because it had been recognized as an opportunity to confer status to fetuses as persons in the context of abortion. So you see for instance, in Indiana, the fetal burial disposition option being required in 2014, and then for miscarriage, and then in 2016 it was required for fetuses following abortion. So I want to say that there's interesting tension here. But embryo and fetal personhood is not new. So we are hearing in the post-Dobbs context, when we listen to the mainstream organizations like National Right to Life Committee, Students for Life, Live Action, Heritage Foundation, Eagle Forum, et cetera, say what their goals are. They wish to abolish abortion, and they wish to abolish abortion based on the premise that embryos and fetuses have equal rights as persons. They're looking to the 14th Amendment of the US Constitution for personhood language, which conferred status to Black Americans following Reconstruction era to recognize them as citizens in the new US context. So they're actually drawing very explicitly upon racial justice rhetoric, calling personhood the North Star of the anti-abortion movement. Abolishing abortion is a direct connection linking anti-abortion advocacy with abolitionism to overturn slavery 150 years ago. So their present day work, one, they're telling us that personhood is their explicit goal, and it is an absolutist goal. It is not just going to impact abortion. It is and will impact contraception. It will and is impacting the surveillance of miscarriage and pregnancy outcomes. It is and will impact reproductive medicine, including restricting or ending the use of IVF for fertility services, as well as other areas that have not yet been explored. We're seeing some states like Georgia change their tax code to include fetuses as children with a sort of ultrasound attached to your annual tax return to receive credit on your annual requirement for taxes. We're going to see changes to the criminal statute, or interpretations of changes to the criminal statute, as the Supreme Court justices in Alabama interpreted a law from the 1890s on wrongful death to a child as including IVF embryos in a ruling from February brought by patients from an IVF clinic in Mobile, Alabama, following damages done to their embryos while in storage at their clinic. We can anticipate reinterpretations of inheritance law. Not only can frozen embryos be inherited, but can they inherit? So too with fetal subjects in established pregnancies. And of course, publicly and privately funded life science research with human embryos may very well come to an end. So these are just some of the arenas within and across reproductive health care, but also across health sciences and other areas of social life, the infrastructure of which is ready to be changed because the notion of personhood is embedded so broadly and deeply within US policy that the change of a definition at its base level, such as at the constitutional level, to include embryos and fetuses has massive, massive, massive consequences far beyond abortion. Though I don't wish to undermine its impact on abortion, because that is, as I maintain, it is a life-saving a necessary aspect of health and well-being, especially in a place like the United States, where maternal mortality remains egregiously high among industrialized nations, and we have not yet improved those numbers sufficiently. And disturbingly enough, in Indiana, those numbers are worsening, and that not only befuddles me, but is also sort of an exemplar of what pro-life politics do. Is that they kill, is that they make it lethal to reproduce. So these, I think, are some of the things that we get to pay attention to, which is that person is prominent, is going to continue to find its way. The philosophical effect of these policies is to incrementally accrue a case. So if we can get tax code, if we can get fetal burial requirements, if we can get inheritance law, also if we can get constitutional amendments in a few states, we're beginning to allow for a legal strategy to mount a case for a constitutional amendment at the federal level, which is what their goal is. So we ought to be wary of all these efforts, especially local efforts, because the architects of the personhood strategy, one of them was Roy Moore, who's sort of a defiled figure out of Alabama, sort of charged with pedophilia, also an Alabama Supreme Court justice, laid the plans for exactly how to do this, and they're doing it. So I ought to pay attention. The important part that I think Sophie and I are trying to draw attention to is that repro politics are never isolated from other forms of systemic injustice. And so we ought not take our eye off of what is being obscured from view. So when our attention is being directed to the risks and threats and harms to, say, IVF, we ought to be asking, what about the risks and threats and harms to people who are forced to bear pregnancies in places where giving birth or being born is very lethal, right? And what are the causal factors for that? Systemic racism. As well as anti-environmentalism is a really underexplored dimension. You know, I sort of like exempting here Katie's work. Making a Good Life is a beautiful ethnography that thinks with and through the challenges of reproducing on a planet that is undergoing climate disruption and what that feels like for individuals and people, right? That more attention to the intersections of reproduction and environmental politics is necessary. And I'm sort of, inspired by Katie as well as Sophie's work on these fronts to insist that we keep these in the frame as well. So that is some of what I think of as the work of feminist scholars of reproduction is to ask about the stuff outside the frame and to insist that we bring it in.
I wanted to highlight this one very quickly sentence that I think was the most chilling of the article. Can I read it aloud for our listeners?
Yes, of course. Yeah, definitely.
So Risa and Sophie write, in an age of biocide and impending climate collapse, personifying aborted fetuses as threatened forms of human life, deserving dignified treatment, also frames pro-life legislators as doing moral work, even as their policies will likely, if unchanged, lead to the end of organized human existence. I think this sort of captures precisely what Risa just articulated.
Thanks, Elyse. And Katie, do you want to add anything, especially Risa mentioned your work on anti-environmentalism and the politics of reproduction, maybe on that, or if you have any other comments, please feel free to share them as well.
Yeah, I mean, I have loads to say about that and to discuss, and fascinated to do so. One of the things that I was, hoping that we'd talk about, which is related, is the theme of waste. So as you write in the article, aborted fetuses have gone from being conceptualized as medical waste to, as we've discussed, individual human persons. And obviously, again, the argument about individualism and personhood is really important here. But I'm really fascinated, again, as sort of an outsider and non-American and non-Christian, to know more about what waste is doing here and how it relates to death, killing and murder, and how waste is conceptualized in Christian theology, and as well as, you say, to neoliberal politics. And I think, and again, you mentioned the word responsibility earlier, and I think that's really relevant as well. That's, again, it's that why of abortion and the sort of ideas about intent and intention. And of course, that sort of individualizing of responsibility is something we're quite familiar with in, the climate and environment space, but it's obviously here and has been here for a long time in how we think about abortion and reproductive politics more broadly. So again, I guess I'm sort of thinking about how all these things link together. But also in what you were just saying, it makes me wonder what the sort of broader imaginaries are of the child, of children, so it's not only persons and individuals, but children in particular, and ideas of inheritance, like you mentioned, and that's really fascinating what you were just saying about, consequences for tax and I guess even demographics, actually. If you start it's interesting sort of going down a sort of Michelle Murphy kind of route in the back of my head now, but yeah. I just I'd be really interested to know what you think is going on in terms of conceptualizations of waste, but also conceptualizations of children in the future, with, I guess, well, you can tell me how far ahead and how broad people are thinking when they're coming up with laws like this, but it sounds like it's pretty far ahead from what you were saying. People were anticipating DOPS before it happened, as well as campaigning for it and pushing for it. They were sort of thinking very strategically. So, what is the sort of broader, what are the broader imaginaries that are feeding that strategy, do you think?
Thanks, Katie. So on these questions, I'm probably going to think with my most recent book project, which is on the reproductive politics of embryo adoption, which began at the turn of the 20th century, which gives us a 25-year window into how personhood politics took shape in practice within a kind of unexpected realm of assisted reproduction. And so the saving of embryos created via in vitro fertilization, frozen for potential future use, and remaining unused, the saving of those embryos by typically pro-life evangelical Christians for their own procreative purposes to become parents via gestation, but also to fulfill their pro-life political positionality, their religious orientation to God as being good stewards of God's gifts, God's property, is a corollary to what I think of here as fetal burial bills. So different kinds of reproductive subjects, the IVF embryo, as well as fetal remain following abortion. And yet we're seeing a similar kind of orientation to waste that suggests that there's a value of limiting or reducing waste. So over 1 million embryos in storage across the United States as a result of, as I argue in my book, a lot of anti-abortion policy making, which created conditions for embryos to be hyper-produced in these ways. The US is a very deregulatory environment when it comes to fertility medicine, which is a direct result of anti-abortion politics. And then the fact of those remainders existing created a political opportunity for them to advance a sort of anti-waste, pro-saving political agenda. And embryo adoption became the vehicle or the place for that embryo personhood project to take root. And so the IVF embryo, the savable IVF embryo, and the buryable aborted fetus represent in many ways this figure of innocence that I think propels a lot of pro-life politics, this highly individuated, potentiated figure, though bearing different kinds of potential, yet requiring a particular kind of memorialization effort to give it life, even posthumous life, by burying it and naming it and giving it the right documentation, right? Or with embryo adoption, to transfer it intrauterus for a chance at pregnancy. Most of the embryos transferred into uteruses via embryo adoption do not survive. And so this is not a birth-making process so much as an effort to return in the sort of political rhetoric of the project, return embryos to their proper place based on God's plan. And so there's a lot of death making in embryo adoption, even though that fact is often obscured by the very people who bear the bulk of the risk of embryo adoption. That's the potentially pregnant people, the women, all who I've worked with identified as women who receive embryos into their bodies for a chance at pregnancy and parenthood. And so both require or involve quite a bit of death, and the rhetorical and political work of creating these subjects as innocent lives deserving of protection and care via this anti-waste sort of pro-preciousness approach work hand in hand. And so these two kinds of strategies, very different realms. And embryo adoption is in assisted reproduction. Fetal burial bills about abortion, seemingly different realms, have very common strategic underpinnings. I think that's something I was hoping my book and this article to contribute to, which is how do we learn about the core strategies so that we recognize them when they're applied in unexpected places or in more risky places, right? They take different shape and form. I'm seeing it in efforts to ban and undermine gender affirming care for trans youth, for instance. Very similar rhetoric around protectionism of youth, parental rights. Death is not featuring so much, but if we think more sort of abstractly about what might be at risk of dying in gender affirming care among conservatives who are undermining bodily autonomy, it might be the very idea of the gender binary and the ideology that propels that. So, and these sort of like the nuclear family and the premise of the economy that is requires this, farcical nuclear family to maintain it. Death seems to be a concern of anti-abortion, Christian right politics, but it takes different shapes. And coming to recognize some of these like ingredients of this strategy, I find helpful as we enter into some dark seeming weather forecasts for politically, and it also helps me feel emboldened in not borrowing, but learning from their strategies to counteract them more powerfully. So my hope is that, it took them 50 years to overturn Roe, that it won't take us 50 years to overturn Dobbs, but that hopefully it'll be far less.
Thanks for that optimistic note, Risa. We need it in these really, really dark times, getting darker each day. Elyse, do you have anything else to add? Final remarks, final questions, short questions?
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute myself here. I guess I'm not sure if there's time for a sort of full-on question, but I would like to hear a little bit more about the ethnographic work, Risa, that you have planned in Indiana. I imagine it can't be ethnographic work on the fetal burial bills, which, as I understand, are in most cases now moot in the aftermath of Dobbs, but correct me if I'm wrong. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about that and how this new project is continuing or diverging from your past work on embryo saving. And I'd also like to thank you for this fascinating conversation.
Yeah, thanks for that.
Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to ask if Katie have a related follow-up question.
I was actually just going to add something to what you said before, Risa, in response. So I think what you say about kind of tracking the language and the sort of surprising connections that people make in the space is really important. And I was obviously thinking of your previous work when I was reading this, and I thought about it quite a lot when I was doing a project previously on seed saving and activism around plant seeds, and the different valences of the word saving. And it was really, really helpful to think with your work because of the contrast as much as anything, because I was working with people who were, very concerned about the environment and climate change, and many of them are also quite motivated by anti-capitalism. And so saving seeds was about saving them from being, appropriated and commercialized and commodified, and very much not about sort of the broader notions of salvation. And I think, yes, like you say, we have to kind of track these things, because another aspect of saving is saving the world, saving the planet kind of rhetoric, which could easily kind of find itself attached to some possibly quite disingenuous causes. And then I was just thinking, as you were saying as well, that I think we obviously have to really reckon with and engage with ideas of death in relation to abortion and abortion activism. But I think one of the things that maybe thinking from the environment, or even an environmentalist perspective, reminds us is that it's also about loss. And I think, like you were saying, with the parallel with transgender as well, it's, yes, in one way it's about the death of things like gender binaries and structures that some people really, find incredibly important and have to be preserved and saved at all costs. It's also about the loss that death would entail. And again, I see the parallels with the environment, and similarly sort of thinking about things like extinction, which again we often think of in terms of death, but is also about the failure to reproduce, and so and that kind of loss as well. So yeah, I would just say again, like Elyse, I really found this article fascinating and illuminating, and it's great as it is, but keep on doing what you're doing. And I'd also love to hear more about your new project and how it may or may not take up some of the things that we've been discussing.
Thank you both. So now, with the book being out in the world, it creates more room for exploring. So I'm currently involved in 3 ethnographic projects at various stages of development. So one ongoing that has an ethnographic activity is looking at the response to patients who present in the emergency room with vaginal bleeding in Indiana hospitals. And so that allows us to connect with providers and patients to understand sort of how has this health system responded to a symptom of people who have either self-managed their abortion or received abortion care out of state and are returning for follow-up care in Indiana. And so this is ongoing, which has allowed me to connect also with the 2 abortion providers who provide legal abortion care via exception in Indiana, and have since launched a sort of subsequent study. We're almost through IRB, which is huge, I just want to say. And so we'll be kickstarting that with some undergraduates over the next year, to essentially follow patients who are referred to family planning services. Those are folks who want abortion or are eligible, even if they're not eligible for in-state care and they are being referred out, which is a lot of folks. They will hopefully be channeled through us. And we get to learn sort of like, what is your pathway to care? Prior to Dobbs, most residents of Indiana, over half Indiana residents were traveling out of state already because restrictions are so high, actually. And an interesting poll through our choice Coalition, which is one of the reproductive rights and justice focused organizations in Indiana, focusing on supporting pro-choice candidates. A recent poll they did found that most registered voters in Indiana were not aware of the abortion ban, which tells us a little bit about health literacy in the state, but also raised an empirical question for me about how did all of the bans, essentially, or barriers to abortion care prior to SCA1 create conditions in which it seemed inaccessible already, such as they already thought it was banned, but they didn't, the change was not that meaningful or noticeable because so many were already being forced to bear pregnancies or forced to leave the state, that something has changed, but not that significantly. I don't know, but I'm hoping to find out by being able to be embedded within the health system in the state that is providing legal abortion care, immersed among the people who are trying to create that centralized system to protect itself against legal challenges, which they receive all the time, and also trying to proactively expand. So not only did Dr. Caitlin Bernard successfully navigate challenge from the Attorney General, who challenged her after coming out to state that she provided an abortion to a 10-year-old girl who was a victim of rape, who had to travel to Indiana from Ohio to receive legal abortion care. The Attorney General went after her for violating HIPAA, which is patient protection, right? She did not violate HIPAA. So she successfully navigated that challenge, even in the midst of this kind of like hostile legal environment. She and her colleague, Amy Caldwell, have gone on to challenge the state proactively, most recently in a court challenge led by the ACLU to challenge the state for its definition of life of the pregnant person, because it's incredibly unclear what that means medically. So it really limits their ability to make the professional assessment about what is considered life or health of the pregnant person in an emergency medical context. So these are not just wonderful healthcare providers, but they're also proactive agents for change. It's really powerful to be in connection ethnographically with what's going on. And the other facet of this work is extending sort of my longstanding interest in reproductive medicine. So launching an interview study with providers of reproductive medicine. So IVF providers, reproductive endocrinologists, embryologists, et cetera, across the United States to get a sense for how they're feeling about the state of their work with respect to abortion politics. What connections do they see, among other things? So all of this is under the umbrella of reproducing post-Roe in red states. And as a pregnant, capable person, I am immersed in this in different ways than I realized I would be. And it creates its own ethnographic opportunity. I am also a patient in these spaces, and am taking note not just of what patients are saying and also what providers are doing, but also from someone who's on the exam table and exploring what all these things mean from that vantage. And so my hope, I remind myself too, is to keep in the frame what is being blocked from view, and to learn from my friends and colleagues who are doing really powerful work in other contexts, but whose topics transcend space and time and remain very teachable and important. So thank you for all that you brought today to my own thinking, and I'm hopeful to continue to contribute to tell these stories about what is not just happening, but what is also possible in the ruins of life post-Roe.
Thanks so much, Risa. It's such an important and timely and urgent work. So thanks for doing what you are doing. And many thanks to all of you for joining this conversation, and I hope to read more about your research. Thanks so much.
Our pleasure.
Thank you.